Welcome to another edition of Focus on Alternatives, brought to you by ADISA, the Alternative and Direct Investment Securities Association. This is a podcast-only version of Focus on Alternatives. I'm your host today, Greg Mausz, Chair of the Education Committee with ADISA. And today we have Stephen F. Lovell with Lovell Wealth Management. Thank you for being here, Stephen.
It's good to be here with you, Greg.
So, Stephen, thank you for joining us again today. And as we talk about education and alternative investments, you have a lot of educational experience. Can you walk us through both your degrees and your designations?
Be glad to. I'll start with my FINRA license. I have 7 FINRA licenses. I got one recently called the 79, so I am now officially an investment banker. I have 5 university degrees, and now I've also got 13 financial credentials. And most of those are still in play. There are a couple that go back to an earlier era, let's say 20 years ago, where there was a term in the title that might be senior, and of course, FINRA will not allow you to use such promissory terms.
So just name off a couple of those 13.
Well, certified financial planner, chartered life underwriter, chartered financial consultant, fund specialist, accredited estate planner, but probably most crucially for our listeners, I'm a CAIA, Chartered Alternative Investment Analyst. And that is a very demanding credential. I spent a lot of time on that one. So I'm proud of that. Very involved with the organization that manages that credential called CAIA.
That's an impressive list. So we're talking education here. And one of the reasons that you need to be educated, especially in dealing with alternative investments, is something that's right off FINRA's website. And I'll read it. So alternative and emerging investment products tend to be inherently complex because they often involve novel, complicated, or intricate features that may make them hard to understand and evaluate. And I believe this to be true. Now, what's actually interesting is that most business plans for alts is actually rather simple. It's acquiring a portfolio of real estate, managing it, and selling it in the future. However, as it states here, some of the features are inherently complex. The features, the benefits, the tax consequences, the illiquidity. So I fully appreciate FINRA's comments there. But give us your thoughts on why you need education to deal with alts.
Well, if you want to keep your career intact, you better follow the rules. And new rules are created all the time. For our listeners, Greg and I just walked out of a general session here at the ADISA conference that was based on new regulation and legislative issues. And surely we learned how much is coming down the pike. So if you fall afoul of the rules, there could be consequences. And it's not enough to have your broker-dealer protect you if you're a registered rep or an IAR. It's not enough as a RIA to only look at a couple of products because you're not offering your clients enough. So I would like to tell our listeners about some of these institutions and resources for education.
Please do. Begin to walk us through what I think are some of the key ones, or where should an advisor start from an education standpoint?
Well, Greg, this is a long list. It's close to comprehensive. But of course, I tell everyone who wants to get educated, make sure when you go and get a source, it's a reliable source. And as far as possible, it's free of bias. So here are some of the educational resources for our listeners. And I'm going to leave real estate out because there's so much information about real estate that I would put it in a separate category from most other complex products. Of course, there are the educations that are actually focused on alts or alternative investments. And of course, the best two known there are the CFA, Chartered Financial Analyst, and CAIA, Chartered Alternative Investment Advisor. And then also, they're so integrated that if you are already a CFA, Greg, CAIA will allow you in their 2-part testing program to skip over part 1 and go right to part 2.
Yeah, I've heard of that through different various designations as well, not just that one. But that's good because all this knowledge builds on itself.
It does. And then we have educational institutions that are actually serving that same community of learners. And a couple of really well-known ones are Kaplan. We've all used Kaplan. Mm-hmm. And then also Wiley, which is focused on financial matters. There are also vendors themselves that create separate academies. I'm going to give you the 2 best-known ones. Inland's been around forever. In fact, we're in Chicago right now, listeners, and Inland's headquarters is right few miles away from where we are. They created an academy, Greg, that's focused, again, mainly on real estate alternative investments, but others too. And it's very high quality. And then competing with it is Apollo. And I've, of course, gone to both those sites. The Apollo Academy is even better. And we have really well-known educators doing some of this stuff, people like Keith Black, whom you and I both know and had dinner with recently when we had a board meeting, I think, in Vegas. So again, very high quality. And although they call them sales organizations, the information they provide is, in my view, free of bias. You're learning about strategies, you're learning about tax consequences, you're learning about products. And those are good choices for our listeners. There are also some educators that include some alts materials in their broader financial training. And they often offer CE, or continuing education hours too. And I'm going to mention just two. One is the Financial Experts Network, and the other one is, in my view, a little higher quality. It's CFI, or Corporate Finance Institute. In fact, you can even get CE credits there for well-known credentials such as the CFP, the CLU, and the CHFC. And then there are also industry big players. The three best known being JP Morgan, BlackRock, and then also Morgan Stanley. They have all focused on alts lately because there's been demands from, of course, American investors. And they all three provide very high quality education information on their website. So I would encourage our listeners to go there. And interestingly, JP Morgan has for years produced a great booklet we all go to every quarter, a guide to the markets. And I'm sure you know about that.
Yes.
They also have a guide to alts. And again, it's of equal quality and it's free. Our listeners can go to the JP Morgan site, download the alts guide, and boy, they'll get a lot of help there.
We'll put that link in the show notes.
Yeah, well, you know another really great source? ADISA. ADISA's here.
Yes.
ADISA produced that great guide to alts, and that is a very comprehensive book written by Virginia, very high quality. She's a good writer. She knows her stuff, and that's a reliable guidebook. And again, our listeners can get on that on the ADISA website, right?
Correct.
Okay,
Yep.
good.
Just go to the resource library.
Yeah, surprisingly, I'm going to also recommend that people go to some of the general purpose financial magazines, Forbes, Barron's, Wall Street Journal. They will do the occasional article on this subject matter, and they are also more eager now to get info about alts. They called up a friend of mine recently and asked him to be a writer. Forbes did. Then we also have some of the data reporting companies. They report on number of sales and so on. And the two best known are going to be Preqin and PitchBook.
Right.
And again, if you're doing M&A, mergers and acquisitions, that's a good source.
Well, then I'll also build on that because we also, regarding 1031s, you have Mountain Dell that is laying out all that 1031 data. And then Stanger does a lot of the non-trade REITs, BDCs, interval funds, and tracking that data. And then I also know Blue Vault publishes some information specifically regarding those public alternatives.
Yeah, and interestingly, when Taylor did his presentation yesterday, that information he gets from
The various 1031 sponsors, yeah.
Yeah, it is proprietary. It's not there for the public, but he does a great report for our brethren here at ADISA. And of course, Kevin always does a great job of updating us. So both those items that Greg mentioned are available through ADISA. And if we talk about ADISA, we're talking about conferences, and you also mentioned Blue Vault. Conferences are a very good place to learn about products, investment products, but they're not equally good. So I would say, again, if you're going to go to conferences, listeners, make sure that if you go to a session, it's not a sales pitch. If you're trying to learn about alts, it's more educational focused.
Right. And frankly, the great value of coming to conferences is that you can engage in a conversation. You can hear something and then follow up with that person right after the panel, in a phone call later, at a booth or something like that, and go through the rest of the thoughts that are in your head and fully unpack the questions that you have and get the answers that you need to move your career, client, goal forward.
And it's an exciting way to learn. I mean, I spend a lot of time with books and websites, But to be at a conference like we are right now is much more exciting for learning. And you're with other learners, and they're all keen because it does advance their career, as Greg just mentioned. Then we also have the great due diligence companies like Blue Vault, like Buttonwood, like Mick Law, and like FactRight. And Greg and I tend to go to a lot of these, again, because we're both focused on education for our industry. And some of these due diligence firms do a great job of educating people about investment products.
True.
We also have advocacy. And of course, here at ADISA, we have Hill Staffer. So we get information from the personnel at Hill Staffer.
There's a lot going on in Washington.
Oh, my.
And it really does affect, some of the planning and decisions that you make now when you see certain things coming down the road. So I agree. I mean, keeping up with what's going on in Washington and the rulemaking that's going to affect our investors and FINRA and the SEC is critical.
It is. And it's unfolding all the time.
Absolutely.
All right. So another area for learning is there are a couple of for-profit organizations. And two of the best known are the Markets Group and Opal. Now, they put on conferences every year. And again, they're not focused specifically on alts all the time, but they often are. I just came back from an alts conference in LA, one of the best ones I've ever been to, and the education again was very high quality. But it was very hard to keep up. There was so much you must know already going in there to be able to follow some of the presentations. And then we also have a couple of, I'm going to call them agglomerators. I'm not even sure that's a word, where you get maybe a magazine and they aggregate materials from other magazines. So it makes it easier for, again, our readership to learn about something because it's all in one place, if you will. Another traditional place to get education is from wholesalers. Now, wholesalers used to go to financial planning offices and talk about their specific products. But again, that's a very good starting point for a lot of people who want to learn about alt.
I'll build on that, especially good quality wholesalers. They're going to tell you some of the best practices on applying alts and their particular strategy, but also some things not to do and to avoid doing. So yes, wholesalers are there to help you help educate you about the product or strategy, but they can really help with application as well.
Another great source, and one I'm very accustomed to, is textbooks. You might remember being in high school and you got a textbook and it had some diagrams, some pictures. If I now buy a book, it may be called a book, but it's certainly not the artifact I had from my high school days, Greg. It's now this kind of learning emporium where you can click on things and get a video, you can get an audio, you can get a podcast like we're doing right now. There are website materials that accompany the book. It's a much more active form of learning. And frankly, it's fun to do this kind of learning. And also, there are a lot of us in the industry, such as myself, who write books. And I will be bringing out a book. There'll be a heavy emphasis on alts there. Now, if you're going to go on the web to get information about alts, of course, it's like any time you go to a public source. You got to check the quality of information. You want to find out who the source is. For me, the safest sources are going to be either government agencies, same as if you're looking for health information, and of course, well-known institutions that are not in the sales business, but they're meant to inform you. And then also, if you go on the FINRA site, there's some reasonably good stuff there. And then oftentimes there's a link from a source to another source that will take our listeners to a good place. So that's a lot of learning opportunities for people.
Huge amount. And I'll throw out a couple others that, as you were going through that list, that kind of came to mind. So I know that the iCapital and CASE platforms both have spent a lot of time focused in on advisor education around alts and taking advisors through a process. And then you mentioned some of this media, but there is Investment News, there's Connect Money, and the DIYer are also constantly sending me updates on everything that's going on in the industry. So you can begin to see trends in asset classes, trends with sponsors, trends with product development as different things kind of come to light when you review this daily feed of news.
Yeah, I mentioned a couple of general purpose magazines like Forbes and Barron's, but again, there are a lot of magazines that are specific to our financial services industry, and Investment News being one of the best known, and it's a weekly. DIYer, of course, we like a lot. And then there are a lot of financial planning magazines issued by firms like the FPA, our Financial Planning Association.
Yeah.
And they are specific to our industry.
Stephen, that was a lot of opportunities for the audience to grow in their knowledge of alternative investments. Thank you for taking the time out to walk us through that.
I look forward to seeing you later at our conference, Greg.
Thank you, Stephen. All the best.